Thank you, Janice, and thank you, Rupa. And thank you, everybody, for coming. Something very Canadian about coming to hear people talk about a topic like this on a sunny summer Sunday afternoon when the World Cup's on and so on. And I think there's something kind of charmingly Canadian about having a guy named Saunders, introduced by an eminent professor named Stein, taking the stage at the Aga Khan Center and addressing an audience that contains many Muslim Canadians about Muslims. It's more unflatteringly, it's something a little close to what people call mansplaining these days, I think. But I think I'm in a position to talk about these things partly because of my distance from them. What I'm not capable of doing is talking about the feeling or the experience or the trauma, the dislocation or the fear involved in the experience of moving to a new country, the experience of living right now in the current political circumstances, and so on. I can't speak about the Muslim experience from experience. I am an outsider. And I don't think necessarily being an outsider gives me an advantage on that. I think I'm looking impartially from above at the communities I'm going to be talking about. But impartiality and objectivity are not because of my subject position or because I'm from an Anglo-Canadian background. Those are habits of mind that anybody is capable of. So what I can bring to this topic is the fact that I've been to a lot of the places that we're talking about. I've been, during the last few years, among most of the communities that we're talking about. And I think one thing to be said right now about Muslim communities in Europe and North America is that nobody knows anything. I think most Muslims I know, most Pakistanis and Bangladeshis and Iranians and Ismailis I know understand the full experience going on in Europe and North America now, no more than anybody else. Because, first of all, this is such a new and young population, as we'll discuss. I mean, in Canada, 7 out of 10 Muslims in Canada were born in another country, and half arrived in Canada since 2000. It's an extremely new population. In many of the European countries, it's the same. And second of all, it's such a varied population. We're talking about probably 30 people from 4 continents speaking 30 languages in maybe 50 distinct cultural groups, every skin color, and a religion whose actual practice is actually more varied than almost any other in the world, and more culturally varied. And I would say that 30 years ago, we would not have been talking about Muslims in the West. Muslims in the West, who 30 years ago existed in hundreds of thousands, would not have talked about Muslims in the West. They would not have described themselves that way, and we would not have described them that way. People, when they came to Canada, when they came to Britain, they were Pakistani, they were Ismaili, they were Arab or Egyptian or what have you. Certainly people considered their religion important and considered it a unifying factor in their lives, but Muslim would not have been the main identifier people would have used. And even the people who distrusted immigrants coming from these places, who feared them and so on, a generation ago, did so because they were Arab or because they were brown-skinned or something like that. The notion of Muslim as a category of people did not really exist. If you read the news clippings from the 1970s or halfway through the 1980s, You did not see anybody saying a lot of Muslims are arriving in Toronto. Nationality, ethnicity, skin color were discussed. I think of my friends who are from Pakistan or the newly formed Bangladesh or Lebanon, who I knew as a child and even in university. I'm not even sure if many of them were Muslim. It never came up, right? My Iranian friends, I remember I've had to introduce some of them, and I've had to say, you know, I've known you for 30 years. You're Muslim, right? There are sizable enough Jewish and Christian minorities in those countries that it's worth asking. But it didn't arise. So there are circumstances during the last generation that have caused there to be a thing that we call Muslims in Europe and North America, despite it being one of the most variegated populations around, and that have caused a lot of people from Iran and Lebanon and Pakistan and Bangladesh and Morocco to call themselves Muslim, to decide that that's the preferred identity of pride, partly because national identities in many cases are no longer badges of pride, but are embarrassment or they're scenes of trouble. Some ethnic identities, such as Arab, are no longer things that people feel as much pride in because of the circumstances of the last few years. And so both as a thing that we attach to people because of the things that have happened and that people attach to themselves, there is an artificial thing called the Muslim in the West. But also more importantly, and this is my starting point in examining these populations and examining the immigration experience, is that this has become a term of indictment in politics in many places, a term of fear. And these are dangerous times. An impartial discussion of the Muslim experience in the West is not a neutral academic topic now, because there's enormously dangerous political threats based on the notion, on certain narratives and ideas about Muslim populations in the West. We've seen in the United States reach a point where the official Republican candidate can run on a promise to ban all Muslims from the country. We're now in a situation where a majority of people in Britain voted to leave Europe, the largest group of them voting because they believed a story that their country was going to be flooded by Turks and people like that. Even though, if you were going to examine it objectively, a Britain without the European Union membership would be more likely actually to see more immigration from Muslim countries because it would have to rely on its former colonies and so on. Nevertheless, these sort of fallacies have become dominant enough in politics now that dangerous things are happening. And it's worth stepping back and saying, what's going on here? So today I want to raise three ideas, put three observations out, and I'll use some evidence from my work recently. I've spent a lot of time in the last couple of years in the cities of Europe and to a lesser extent the cities of North America, partly with the World Bank, where I've been working with a group of economists and urbanists on a project that looks at obstacles to integration in Western cities for labor migrants, which has put me into a lot of the more infamous neighborhoods, all the supposed no-go zones in Europe, all of which are fine to go in, by the way. And some other projects, including this one with the German government, looking at architectural interventions that can improve integration, and so on. So I'll draw on some of these things. The 3 points I want to raise, first of all, are that if we must unite the variegated and extremely different populations coming from Islamic countries to the West, that they are following a pattern of integration familiar to other religious minorities who have arrived in the West during the last 100 years, and in some ways, with all the difficulties and speed bumps and challenges that are involved in that process, they're much earlier in that process than any other group, but that they're following a very familiar pattern. Second of all, that this is being complicated by the experience of extremism, of terrorism, that is only tangentially related to the actual experience of diasporas in the West, but that certainly both colors and creates fear in their experience and changes our opinion of it. And second of all, that this is complicated and confounded by the recent experience of large populations of migrants and refugees moving into Europe, who partly overlap with that population because a lot of them are Muslim, and partly also confuse our perception of what's happening with the main populations around us. So I'm going to look at those three things. First, let's take a look broadly at who we're talking about here. When we talk about Muslims in the West, who are we talking about? And first of all, it's a very, very new group of people. If you're going to talk about Muslims in general, in Europe, the average age of a Muslim is 32. Average age of a European is 40. It's a very new population. The largest group of them have arrived since 1990. In Canada, even more so. As you can see, in 1971, there were only 33,000 Muslims in all of Canada. Now there's a million. As I said, 7 out of 10 Muslims in Canada were born in another country. This is an immigrant population. The second generation has barely started, it's just in university now. And half of them have arrived since 2000. So, and we're talking about very, very different populations, as we can see here. In Europe, well, I identify 4 different groups of Muslims in the West by the ways that they have come to be in the West. The first is the sizable population of Muslims who've always been in the West since the beginning of Islam. Europe has had Muslims since there was Islam. Majority or plurality of the populations of Albania, Kosovo, Bosnia, Turkey, of course, have always been Islamic since that religion existed. Plus sizable populations in the rest of the Balkans, in the Caucasus, of course, and in Crimea. And those populations have always been part of Europe. They're by most measures that you could perform through ways of life and attitudes, they're indistinguishable from other religions living in the same regions. The second group are the post-colonial populations, notably the people from the Indian subcontinent, from what eventually were the 4 countries of the Indian subcontinent, who migrated to Britain after India ceased to be a colony, and the people from the Maghreb, from Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia, who migrated to France after its colonial experience was over in the 1950s and 1960s. Now, these populations, of course, did not technically arrive as immigrants at all. Anyone coming from India and the countries it eventually formed, or from Algeria in the 1950s and early 1960s to Britain or France, was coming as a citizen or subject of those countries carrying a British or French passport, fluent in the language, more or less, of the country they are arriving in, and so on. And entering usually blue-collar labor. And the third population arriving shortly after that, starting at the very end of the 50s and the 60s, was the labor migrant populations. Most notably the 2 million Turks who came to Germany, the Gastarbeiter, guest workers, in the 1960s. Also the sizable population of Moroccans who came to Belgium and to a lesser extent France and the Netherlands as labor migrants, brought in en masse, actually kicked out to some extent, and so on. But some other populations, the Bangladeshis, after Bangladesh came into being in 1971, who came to Britain, were a much more labor migrant population than a post-colonial population. They were brought over in the 70s and 80s, specifically with filling labor gaps in mind, and thus had a different experience than the Indians and so on. And a lot of these migrated worker populations did not have access to full citizenship for a very long time, and that shaped and colored their experience. And finally, fourthly, a population who've arrived since the 1980s, who are an extremely varied population who've come to the West. They include everybody from the wealthy Gulf Arabs who live in Kensington and Chelsea, to the Afghan refugees who came as a result of the war, to a lot of middle-class people from the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia and the Middle East, to migrants who've crossed the Mediterranean seeking labor from Africa and from North and West Africa. Canada's and the United States' Muslim population almost entirely consists of this fourth group of people who've come since 1990 or thereabouts, of very different classes and backgrounds. Canada, you have a lot of Pakistanis, you have a lot of Iranians, you have a lot of Lebanese, a few Turks, and of course the Ismaili population, to whom we owe this center, who arrived in the 1970s as refugees, largely after having been kicked out of Africa, or frightened out of Africa, and so on. And we currently have a complicated range of refugee and migrant populations that we'll discuss. And the numbers of these people are never as large as people think. Why do people think there are a lot more Muslims? Here, this graph shows you, this is thanks to The Economist. The orange pie slices are the number of Muslims people think are in their countries, and the dark red pie slices are the actual percentage in those countries. People in Britain think that more than 20% of their neighbors are Muslim. In fact, 5% are, and so on. Germany, they think it's 19%, it's 6%. I should note that even if the 1 million refugee claimants who've arrived in Germany during the last year, even if 100% of them were settled, and the Germans, well, we'll talk about that, and even if all of those people stayed, that would raise it by 1%, because it's a country of 80 million. So why do we think that there's so many? Because they're controversial, they're in the news, always for the worst reasons, and because they're an urban population. Muslims in Europe and in North America of almost any background are settling in the cities. So they're visible. They're visible because often have different head coverings as well and so on. Because it's an almost entirely urban population. Although I should note, in Canada and in a lot of other places, it's more fair to say that it's a suburban population. The Iranians and Arabs who've settled in Toronto and Montreal, where most Muslims in Canada live, tend to be an outer suburban population. The location for this particular place for the Ismaili Center and the Aga Khan Museum is perfectly situated right next door to Thorncliffe Park, which is a perfect example. Muslims don't tend to want to settle with other Muslims, though. In enough of a population density in the city that you can have a mosque. But what we found in Europe and in North America and everywhere else is that people want to settle where there are people from similar national and cultural backgrounds, not where there are people of similar religious backgrounds. Muslims from India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, they want to live in cities, in urban neighborhoods near Hindus and Sikhs from those same places, not near Moroccans or Turks or something like that. And you see this pattern repeated with people from all over the place. Lebanese Muslims tend to want to live near Lebanese Christians in Canada. Most Lebanese Arabs in Canada are Christian, and so on. People form cultural communities rather than religious communities, and you see that in Europe a lot. You see, I mean, if you go to Whitechapel Spitalfields in East London, you can see a building that was it was a Huguenot Protestant church used by my ancestors, and then it was a synagogue used by the Eastern European Jews who turned that area into a totally untrustworthy Jewish ghetto in the 19th century and brought us the idea of fish and chips. And now it's a mosque run by the Bangladeshis and so on. You see people following cultural patterns rather than geographic ones. So are they integrating? I mean, that's the question that people ask. It's a little bit unfair in some ways because integration is a complicated thing. I have some relatives who haven't integrated yet, but it's the question that's in the air. That is one of the most complicated topics around. What is integration? There's a couple different ways of looking at integration. I mean, for example, you can have communities of people who live in a previous century in many other ways who are highly religious, like the Mennonites, or like a lot of ultra-Orthodox Jewish or Hasidic communities and so on, who could not be described as having the values of the society around them in many other respects, but who do very well in education and in the economy, and who are functional members of society, and so on, who nobody would say weren't integrated, and so on. And you can get people who look and act just like me, who have no respect for the rule of law and so on, and end up in prison, who you could not call integrated. So it's very complicated. One way of looking at integration that I like to use for a lot of things that I do is integration into the education and employment system. I mean, what we found over and over again is that when communities who come to the West come to have the same number of years of education as the average people around them, and come to have the same level of employment and income as the people around them, that they are effectively seen as by everyone around them as being integrated. So even if there's big cultural differences and so on, the fact of educational and employment integration tends to make the cultural stuff appear to be colorful differences rather than fundamental differences. That's one way of looking at it. And let's look at Muslim populations in this sense. In North America, Muslims, if you're going to take all these diverse groups and describe them as one average thing, are among the most educated populations in the continent. In both Canada and the United States, Muslims are the second most educated religious group after Jews and ahead of all Christian groups in terms of amounts of university education and so on for people born here. So yeah, in the United States, Muslims have the same level of university education. By some measures, it's actually higher than the average population. Are just as likely to be middle class and just as likely to be employed. The United States has particularly prosperous Muslim populations. It's why it's so completely absurd that you have an entire branch of the Republican Party convinced that this most successfully middle class population, who's everybody's doctor in the United States, is somehow a civilizational threat who are out to impose religious law on people or something like that. Of all the places for that type of politics to arise, there's less basis for it. There's no basis for it anywhere. There's less basis for it than in the United States. Britain is interesting because in European countries, I mean, people from countries like Iran and Pakistan who come to Canada and the United States tend to be middle class, tend to have university degrees, even if they end up having to be taxi drivers for a generation first. The people who came from those countries to most parts of Europe came as blue-collar workers. They came as factory workers or agricultural workers and so on, and have often had a bad go of it because the economy, the post-industrial economy has treated them badly, and they did not have the educational resources. And a generation ago, you would have looked at the Turks in Germany or the Bangladeshis in Britain as being extremely marginal people who had extremely low levels of education, extremely high levels of poverty, and seemed to be falling off the edge of society because they had come for an industrial economy that no longer existed in those countries, and their children were dropping out of school at 16 and so on. Some of those things are still problems, but what has happened during the last 10 years is a huge educational catch-up and overtaking of the average population. So we see in this graph, in terms of high school, the British equivalent of straight A's, which is 5 A to C GCSEs, Bangladeshis went from being way behind the British average, and around 2010, Bangladeshi Britons overtook white English people in educational success and have now soared ahead. Pakistanis have caught up and are sort of lingering around the same level, and we see that with the other Muslim populations. In terms of education, they just soared, partly because of some interventions designed to keep kids in school that Britain did smartly. We see that in other countries as well. Is finally a catching up in the second and third generation to educational norms and a real desire to get ahead of other people. That has not always been reflected in income, though. This is Canada. And if you look at the rates of low income, so I don't know whether that's poverty, but of unusually low income by place of origin, people from Pakistan, the Middle East, from places where Muslim populations tend to come from, have much higher rates of low income. Interestingly, even though they actually have quite high rates of university education and so on. That's a phenomenon. I wouldn't say that it's totally not a phenomenon of racial exclusion or something like that, because there is some evidence of that. But it's also a phenomenon of the fact that it is a new first-generation population who, again, 70% of whom were born in another country, many of whom have trouble having their credentials, their university degrees recognized, their professional credentials recognized in Canada. It's a cliche that every taxi driver in Toronto has a master's degree. But the fact is that when I talk to taxi drivers, a lot of them do have a master's degree from somewhere like Pakistan or and so on, and are sacrificing their future for their children's. So optimistically, you could look at this high rate of low income among these populations as being the effect of it being a very, very new immigrant population. You could say that the Southern European Catholics and Eastern European Jews went through exactly the same low income experience when they were only 10 years in Canada. In Britain, we see it reflected, in Europe, we see it reflected to an even larger degree. Poverty rates among Bangladeshis and Pakistanis in Britain and among Turks and Moroccans in the Netherlands and Belgium are an order of magnitude higher than among the average population. And this is a very serious problem. Again, these are people who are brought as imported labor for an industrial economy that no longer exists, and that really there was nothing done in the education system and so on until very recently to reverse this. And unemployment, we see the same problem, that this is how people categorize themselves on the census. Much higher unemployment rate of over 20% among Arabs, South Asians in Canada than among the average population. In France, if you look at it across time, you see a catching up. You see that it takes about 6 years after people arrive in France for them to reach the average level of employment of their group of immigrants, which in France tends to lag 10 to 15% below the average employment rate perpetually. There's a professor at the Monk School, Stephen, Janice. I don't have my speaking notes because I think Janice has them in her lap. But what's the name of your colleague who studies? Jeffrey Wrights. And that was all I needed from that speaking note, by the way. Previously to this was called me winging it. Jeffrey Wrights, who did a really interesting comparative bit of research, which is going to be published this year, comparing economic integration patterns of Muslims in Canada, France, and Quebec. Kind of had to treat Quebec differently because it's a whole different political situation. And he found that Muslim populations in Canada, among the people who were born in other countries, it takes about 10 years on average for them to reach the level of economic success of average Canadians. But interestingly, among the Canadian-born children of those immigrants, the second generation, it takes 0 years. There's not a delay in attainment in the second generation in that way, which I think Canadians know from experience. In European countries, it varies much more highly. In France, he found there is a perpetual gap between Muslim French people and non-Muslim French people in terms of inclusion in the workforce, the amount of money earned, and so on. And this is a problem across Europe. France has a particular version of this problem. Again, Muslims in France who come from the Maghreb, they arrived speaking the language as well as anyone in France. They're culturally more or less as French as anyone. Yet because of economic effects of France's very rigid guaranteed job contract, which is inaccessible to outsiders, and because, frankly, of racism, that France is very, very divided between a brown-skinned population who are stuck in casual labor and a white population who have all the good jobs. And this continues across the generations. And this is a problem in European countries to a large degree that we're seeing. Not everywhere. Britain is very close to overcoming it. Interesting things are happening in Germany to overcome what was a huge gap for many years. But you can say, you look at the difference between the North American experience of people from the same countries versus the experience of people from, say, Pakistan who end up in northern England. And you realize that the children of the Pakistanis, often from the same parts of Pakistan, who arrive in Toronto or Montreal, all immediately have the same level of university success and employment success and income as average Canadians. The children of the people from the same place who settle in a city in northern England lag behind and have troubles and so on. You can't attribute that to the culture of the place they're coming from if they have different experiences depending what country they arrive in. There's something in the places where people settle that causes these differences. And that's a very complicated thing to analyze. And it can interact with cultures and so on. I mean, there are cultural differences among different groups. The Deobandi populations of Pakistan, who tended to settle in the northern cities, do have a much more patriarchal, conservative culture, you could say, which contributed to a lot of the economic exclusion that happened there. They were very resistant to women entering the workforce. For example, in parts of Britain where much of the only surviving sources of income tended to be female-dominated employment and that sort of thing. So there are interactions with specific subcultures. There's reasons why people from some parts of Pakistan have done better in some cities than others. On the other hand, people from those same places have had better experiences when they come to Canada, the United States, than when they come to Britain. So we cannot put this down to simply being regional cultures or religion and so on. It's much more complicated than that. And the other way of looking at integration is to look at values converging. At a minimum level, it's fair to say that you cannot really talk about a population as being part of the society around it unless its people share a set of sort of core national values. I wouldn't even call them Western values because they're values of any successful country now, which is respect for rule of law and the state, and it's the respect for the secular institutions around you, and respect for basic human equality. Those three things are sort of the crucial baseline ingredients for any functioning pluralist society. And if people don't share those values, you can have little pockets of exception. But if people don't share those values in general, you do run into problems. And it's worth asking whether communities are doing that. And here's a set of figures that have become most predominant in discussing Muslim communities in the West and their level of integration, which is tolerance of homosexuality. We've had major surveys during the last few months in Canada by Environics and in Britain by other groups of social values of Muslim populations. For some reason, the headline that came out of that was that integration is going very badly because look at Canada, 80% of Canadians say homosexuality should be tolerated. Only 36% of Muslims in Canada say that homosexuality should be tolerated. Surely that's a sign of poor integration. But we have to remember what I said earlier. 7 out of 10 Muslims in Canada were born in another country. Look at the other countries where they came from, down at the bottom of that chart. In Pakistan, 1% of people say homosexuality should be tolerated. 1% in Tunisia, 5% in much more sophisticated Turkey, and so on. For people during their own lifetimes, for people over a generation or two to go from 1% tolerance to 36% tolerance would be impressive. For people largely during their own lifetimes, to go from 1% of them tolerating something to 36% of them tolerating something is actually a sign of very, very successful integration. You would have not seen other religious minority communities in the West adapting values like that about women and sexual minorities as quickly in the past. It shows partly that the information culture around us is, and that's just the average. The Canadian-born generations tend to converge very quickly on issues like this, on issues like patriarchy. The classic environics question is, must the father be the head of the family? Americans tend to say yes to a much larger degree than Canadians on that one, by the way. And you see a near total convergence among the Canadian-born children of immigrants on questions like that. And on actual actions in the world that indicate values. A big one is how many children you have. If you have fewer children than your mother did, that indicates a couple things. First of all, it indicates that you're using birth control, and you're okay with that, and you've somehow persuaded your husband to use birth control, or to tolerate you doing so. It means that you've accepted a type of family in which the woman in the family is not simply there for reproduction and that sort of thing. And what we see among Muslim communities in the West is very fast convergence of family sizes with those of the average populations. So new immigrants always have a large family as soon as they've arrived. A lot of people put off childbirth until after they've arrived. So certainly anybody who works at a public housing authority knows you need to have big apartments for new families arriving from new countries. They tend to have a lot of children. Their Canadian or British or German-born children tend to have a number of children that tends to be one more than the national average. And then the next generation, from everything we can tell, it's a very small sample group now, tends to have almost the same number of children as the national average. So partly, first of all, I mean, that was sort of the starting point for the reason why I called my book The Myth of the Muslim Tide. Those pie charts, those pie slices are not going to increase by very much. Partly because the non-Muslim populations of our countries are having more children than before, but also because you see a very quickly falling birth rate among it. That's a sign of integration in a number of important ways. Convergence of family sizes. It means people are doing the things around them. It also means people are following the economic logic around them, though. People have the number of children they can afford, and the type of housing they can afford can hold. A lot of people would like to have more children, and so on. So anyway, and finally on the question of values, this has been surveyed more times than almost anything else. Here we see 3 different surveys in Britain, France, and a few months ago in Canada, where people are asked if you're proud to be Canadian, proud to be British, or whether democracy is working well in France, where Muslims answered yes to a much, much larger degree than non-Muslims. And in fact, if you see it broken down, and we've had dozens of different organizations ask this question in dozens of different ways. Do you have respect for the army and police? Do you like, the secular institutions and so on? Do you see yourself as more British than wherever you're from? And so on. And it always comes out this way. In fact, generally Muslims tend to be more loyal to the countries they live in than any other religious group. Sometimes Jewish citizens in Britain have a slightly higher rate even, and so on. It's interesting that religious minorities tend to be, partly because these are people who've fled places where you do not respect the state or its institutions. And also because the simple fact that migration to another country, whether you're immigrating or whether you're fleeing a war and choosing to go to a faraway country, is an extremely difficult and expensive process that puts huge strains on families. People do not migrate to countries because they hate them. That feeling of hating your country that some people have, and we'll discuss extremism in a bit, tends to be something from people very far removed from the migration experience. And then, of course, the third way that some people take integration to be understood is religion. Now, an extreme extent where you get people who say, well, this is a Christian continent, and as long as you have a religious minority, they cannot be described as integrated, which is ignoring the history of religious plurality in the West. Otherwise, you get a lot of liberal-minded people like me who say, okay, we do not want a lot of people who are extremely religious around because there's a risk that they'll impose their religious values on us, and we don't like that, which is, I think, a legitimate worry. And Muslim populations are becoming more religious than their parents were, partly because you get a lot of people who are coming from very secular countries like Bangladesh or Turkey, whose children prefer to take on a more Islamic identity. And partly because, as I said, it's the one identity that people have to seize onto. The national and ethnic identities are no longer badges of pride, and so on. But you do see a higher degree of religiosity. It has to be kept in the context of this graph on the right, which is that Muslims tend to fall to the level of religiosity of the country around them. A lot of people were alarmed a few years ago when there was a survey saying 40% of American Muslims say that they're Muslim first and American second, which certainly sounds like a dangerous degree of disloyalty to your country, until you read the rest of the survey, which said that 49% of American Christians say that they're Christian first and American second, and so on. And you see that convergence with the level of religiosity of the country around you. But the reason why it worries people is because we tend to think, okay, if they're more religious, they're going to become more extremist. And that's the one area where we need to talk about the next thing, which is the small groups of people who fall into extremism. We've had a large volume of intelligence agency research into what causes people to be attracted to Islamic extremism and jihadism over the last few years. And it's very, very difficult as confounded agencies to find connections. The level, immigration experience is not a predictor of radicalization. In fact, it's almost one of the most strong negative predictors. People who were born in another country are among the least likely to join ISIS or Al-Qaeda or somewhat. Poverty is a very poor predictor. It tends to be people who are financially comfortable. Religiosity is actually an extremely poor predictor. The most religious Muslim families are among the least likely to produce children who go into Al-Qaeda and so on. In fact, as we can see from the graph on the right there, almost 4 out of 10 Americans who join ISIS are from Christian families. And I've seen similar numbers in Northern Europe and so on. It tends to be the most secularized families that produce that. So when we look at the question of who is joining it, it's worth looking at the work, and a lot of intelligence agencies, I know CSIS has started following this line of work of Paul Gill at University College of London. CSIS has switched over to his theory almost completely, which is to look at the predictors of terrorism in terms of actions. And the one big predictor is a propensity to violence or criminality. It's what unites all of these communities. People who have fallen into crime, and especially prison, often because they've dropped out of school at 16 or something, and fall into gray market economies, then they fall into petty criminality, then they fall into capital C criminality, then they go to prison and they get radicalized in prison and so on. That tends to be the big thing. The things that tend to indicate it are people who've changed religion within the past few months, like not years before. Usually it's days before it's part of the whole radicalization experience, and so on. People who commit violent terror attacks, it turns out, aren't identifiable by the ideas they hold in their head, but by the things they do. The violent tendencies come first, and the thinking second. And I certainly saw that in Molenbeek, where it was the kids who fell out of school and fell into crime, who became from generally non-religious households, who had none of their parents' culture. These were not culturally Moroccan kids, these were culturally Belgian kids who fall into this. The other thing we know is that people don't get attracted to extremism in Europe or North America unless there's something going on, some conflict going on in the Middle East or some other part of the world that they symbolically feel affiliated with. We had a long period between about 2006 and 2012 or so when there were basically no significant levels of jihadist political activity or people in the West joining these groups in North America or Europe. It just dropped away to zero. in those years. Why did it drop away? Because there weren't big events that symbolically attracted people. Now, there's not a lot we can do about the war in Syria, which is the big thing attracting people now, and we're not really here to discuss. They're going to have a forum here in October about what to do about the war in Syria, and we can all discuss that. But the one thing it does show us is that the things that are attracting people to extremism are not things coming out of the communities of Muslims in the West. It's not something percolating up from within these neighborhoods or these communities. It's something coming from outside in the Middle East, and drawing people in, drawing the marginally criminal, the vulnerable, the disenfranchised into the orbit of these things. Now, very quickly, I'm going to talk about the other compounding factor, which is the migrants coming to Europe, which has complicated it. Almost all of them are going, 6 out of 10 of them are going to Germany or Sweden. When we talk about the refugee phenomenon, I mean, Canada has like 25,000. Germany's had 1 million. Sweden's had something like 400,000, something like that. So very, very large numbers, but only to a couple of countries. It's not a phenomenon in Britain. It's not a phenomenon in most European countries at all. They pass through that big circle in Hungary. Those are people passing through. Hungary kicks them out. Hungary's not very nice to people these days. And the other thing we need to remember about them is that this is a refugee emergency. This is not a flood that's overtaking Europe or something like that. We had a huge peak in the 1990s when the former Yugoslavia sent 500,000 migrants to especially Germany. And then we had almost no refugees moving to Europe during the entire 2000s. It was the lowest point of refugee movement in all of history, despite 2 major wars going on around the world. Okay, 2 second wars going on around the world. And now we have this other spike, which now has started to go down a bit and so on. So we have a one-time spike of people. Generally, historically, about 2/3 have returned. That depends on how long the war goes on, and maybe more than 2/3 will return, maybe not. But it is a temporary thing. The other thing to recognize is that the people you see flooding into Europe, large numbers of them are not refugees. If you look at the nationalities of people these are the people applying for refugee status. Syria, yes, you would qualify as a refugee, and that is close to half of the people. Kosovo, 0 people from Kosovo would ever qualify as a refugee in Europe. Afghanistan, yes. Albania, no. Iraq, yes. Pakistan, probably not. Eritrea, yes. Serbia, Ukraine, Nigeria, no. So you have large numbers of people who are not refugees. They're people seeking work and so on. And then of the people who applied, those million people who applied in Germany, 140,000 have been accepted under the United Nations 1951 Charter as being refugees. Probably more will be. The German cabinet minister responsible for these things told me that she thinks between 40 and 55% of refugee applicants will be accepted as legitimate refugees in Europe, in Germany. That's of the applicants, which is a fraction of the number of migrants. Now, they have a big problem in this sense, because they have no idea what to do with the hundreds of thousands of people they're not accepting. They can't legally deport them to the countries they came from under anti-refoulement laws, as they're called. And they don't really know what to do with them. This is a big problem for the Muslim communities of Europe, because you get these populations of people who have not been accepted, but not kicked out, who are knocking about the continent, who tend to be male. Refugees tend to be families. These people who aren't accepted tend to be labor migrants, and they tend to be male. They tend to do things that get in the headlines. They tend to attack people at train stations and stuff like that, which hurts. It becomes the public image. Many of them aren't even Muslim, or from countries where people are Muslim, but they're brown-skinned people doing things, hanging out in the shopping malls, doing things in the streets, getting involved in petty crime, and they give a bad reputation to the established communities, who, as we saw, are generally following a difficult but reliable pattern of integration and so on. That's obscured by the fact that you have people knocking around who are not immigrants or refugees or anything like that, who are confusing things. And that's going to create a political crisis in Europe. It already has, to a large extent, if we don't figure out something to do with the people who aren't accepted. Canada doesn't have that problem. We go get people and we bring them in, and so on. We don't have people knocking around in large numbers who are not immigrants, even though we have a history of people using temporary migration as a way to become permanent migration and so on. So we have, in summary, we have a pattern the usual bumpy pattern of integration being followed by Muslim populations who've arrived, which is confounded by the tricky situation of extremism and confounded by a very complicated emergency migration pattern into Europe right now. And I would say that what I would ask out of this is that we learn to separate these three things in our mind and learn to be able to see the patterns that are happening, to recognize our neighbors in these patterns, and to understand that they are following a pattern that our ancestors did not that long ago. Thank you very much.